All right, class, welcome back. Good morning and happy Monday. It's weird for me to say that because I'm actually recording this video last Friday, right after you guys left school. So right here in this video, it's about 3:44 on Friday afternoon. But of course, you guys have already had your weekend and you're back in school on Monday. By this point, I am sitting on a beach somewhere in Cancun, Mexico, and I'm sending lots of good vibes your way as you probably dealt with that really crummy weather over the weekend. Nevertheless, the power of technology allows me to be with you today and to be giving your lecture. So even though I'm in Mexico, so try not to be too jelly. So we'll hop into the lecture here in just a moment, but before we do so, just a little bit of housekeeping. Of course, I will be gone for the whole week this week, Monday through Friday, which means Mr. Henderson is going to be your sub. So make sure that you guys treat him with more respect than you treat me, because let's face it, right? Yeah, give him more respect than you give to me. Looking forward to this week for your the roadmap, the schedule. Today, obviously, you're going to be watching the lecture here in class. Tomorrow, so Tuesday, and then Wednesday, you will have activities in class, just like normal. They'll pop up on Google Classroom, just like normal. Then on Thursday, you will have the Chapter 22 quiz in class, and your Chapter 22 reading guide will be due at 11:59 p.m. So very typical week for you guys coming through. Friday, you can cheer, because Friday I'm going to give you guys as a study day. So lecture Monday, text activity Tuesday, writing activity Wednesday, quiz Thursday, reading guide due Thursday night, study day on Friday. Real simple week for you guys here. So without further ado, let's hop right into this lecture. So when we left off last week, we were talking about Chapter 21 and a lecture called Normalcy and Good Times. And in this lecture, we talked about the presidents of the 1920s and how they were very withdrawn type presidents, how William Harding and then Calvin Coolidge were both, they favored a rather passive presidency. And we talked about how that then allowed the economy of the 1920s to sort of run its own show, right? So the 1920s economy was all about prosperity. It was about increasing purchasing power. It was about corporations slashing work time for workers, even though wages were going up. And it was about mass production, especially of things like cars, and about new consumer products. So the economy of the 1920s really takes off and explodes in a big way. Now, you know, the economy and the culture of the 1920s, the Roaring 20s, right? If you look to the title of this unit, the title of the unit is called Boom and Bust. So you can kind of see in that title, the boom part of that title refers to basically the whole decade of the 20s, right? Throughout the whole decade of the 20s was one great big economic and cultural boom in the United States. However, when we get to the late 20s, especially 1929, the good years are going to end. And several factors of the economy and long-term factors, by that I mean several long-term factors, combined with several factors that happen sort of quickly, all in succession in 1929, are going to expose things that have been getting worse in the economy, or sort of structural flaws in the economy, I should say, for some time. And this kind of confluence of different bad economic factors are going to knock the U.S. economy off its feet and create the worst economic depression that the United States has ever seen. So Chapter 22, the Great Depression, begins. So Section 22.1 talks about the causes of the Great Depression. And your textbook devotes a whole section to this because there isn't really one cause that's easy to point to in the Great Depression. Kind of the pop culture interpretation of the Great Depression is that the stock market collapse on Black Tuesday wrecked the economy and drove the U.S. economy into depression. The reality is that yes, the stock market played a really big part, but there were many, many causes that made the Depression into a bigger crisis than it probably would have been. So we're going to take a whole section and just look at the variety of causes that worked together to wreck the U.S. economy starting in 1929. So in 1928, Herbert Hoover becomes president of the United States. And it's somewhat ironic that Herbert Hoover becomes president of the United States because he was one of the few good cabinet member appointees of the Harding administration. And he's going to be known as a guy who is a brilliant economic mind, and he's kind of elected based on his economic record. So unfortunately for the historical reputation of Herbert Hoover, he's going to be elected like a year before the good economic times are going to end. And it's not really his fault that the Depression starts, but he's going to be saddled with dealing with this economic crisis nonetheless. So let's take a look at some of the causes of the Great Depression. The first big cause of the Great Depression was a decade-long bull run in the stock market. And if you've never heard of the phrase bull run to describe the stock market before, when we talk about the stock market and whether the price goes up and down, traders have given sort of an animal spirit to the stock market as a way to describe whether stock prices are going up or whether they're going down. And the two animal spirits that they've given to the stock market are a bull and a bear. So a bull market and a bear market. And a bull market is used to describe a stock market when the prices are going up. And that's because when a bull attacks, it uses its horns and it attacks in an upward motion, right? So when the stock market is going up, it's a bull market. It's rampaging ahead. The opposite of a bull market is called a bear market. And then that's because when a bear attacks, it swipes down. So when the stock prices go down, it's a bear market. Also, bears tend to hibernate as well. So the 1920s had been one great big long bull run in the stock market. And when stock prices go, typically stock prices will go up and they'll go down, and they'll go up gradually over the long term, but as they're going up, they fluctuate minorly up and down the whole time. In the 1920s, the stock market really didn't even fluctuate. It just went straight up for years and years and years and years and years. And in the stock market, rarely do you have several years back to back of sort of uninterrupted straight upward growth. And in the 1920s, you're going to have an entire decade of it. So by the end of the 1920s, the stock prices were probably way too expensive and overvalued what the stocks were. At the beginning of the decade, at least, stock prices were going up, but they were good value for the companies. At the end, it was almost sort of an investor FOMO, right? Have you guys ever heard of that acronym? FOMO, FOMO, fear of missing out. Stock prices had been going up for so long that investors were like, man, if I don't get in, I'm just losing money, right? Well, the problem is that when you have people investing just because they're afraid of losing money, you're not investing based on the quality of the stock, right? So so you have these dangerous, inexperienced investors start to invest in the stock market, and the prices weren't reflective of the actual value of that stock, right? The stock prices were too high. The stock market was ready for a big correction downwards. So another cause that you get for the Great Depression is that there was a lack of diversity in the economy. The 1920s had been a period of really tremendous economic growth. However, most of that growth was being concentrated in the automobile and the construction industries. So if you look at a lot of other industries like the farming industry or the steel industry, those industries weren't growing as fast as probably they would have. So looking at the U.S. economy as a whole, looks like things are good. However, the growth is really confined to only one or two markets, right? So that kind of that growth in those one or two markets masks sort of weak growth across the board at the end of the decade. So another cause of the Great Depression was what by the end of the 1920s we consider a maldistribution of wealth. So we talked about one of the impacts of the giant corporations in the late 1800s and early 1900s, that these corporations had been merging, and that the owners of these corporations had been amassing fantastic fortunes. But a lot of Americans were kind of being left behind by this growth, right? So you had increasing economic inequality. Well, when you have an economy that's growing, but most of the money is flowing to a certain small portion of the economy, those people get really, really, really rich. Well, when you're really rich, you don't spend most of your fortune, right? You just keep accumulating money. So if that money would be going instead to the sort of poorer or lower classes, those people would be spending more of that money and driving economic growth. The fact that most of the economic growth, the money, was going to a small handful of people who couldn't possibly spend all that money, meant that that money was sitting in the bank accounts of the wealthy rather than being spent on businesses. So maldistribution of wealth had sort of been a headwind for businesses to grow into, right? It had been a sort of a drag or an anchor on business growth. Another cause of the Great Depression was the domestic credit structure. And we talked about that last week with our consumer unit, that one of the things that Americans start to do in the 1920s is to buy more goods on credit. And credit, of course, is where you are allowed to purchase the good, but you have to pay back that good later. Now, more and more Americans had been picking up more and more and more and more debt. As they accumulate more debt, of course, if economic times are good and you keep your job and your income increases, typically that's okay to maintain a little bit of debt. But if you get more and more and more in debt, you get more and more and more exposed to, if the economy turns down, you don't have any way to pay back that debt, right? So the fact that many Americans are in debt and all of a sudden the economy is going to go on a downturn is going to make problems worse for many Americans. Okay, I think this is the place to talk about this here too. So Americans hadn't just been picking up debt to buy consumer goods. Another way that Americans were going into debt was actually by doing something called purchasing stock on margin. Okay, now typically when you invest in the stock market, you have a pile of cash that you already have and you buy stocks with it, right? So you buy a stock with money that you already have. In the 1920s, stock markets began allowing people to borrow money to invest in the stock market. So if you think about this, if you do this smartly, buying on margin, borrowing money to invest in stock is a really good way to sort of to enhance the profits that you make. So if I only have $1,000, but I go and take a $10,000 loan from the bank and use that $10,000 loan to invest in the stock market, and the stock market goes up, I can then sell those stocks, right? Take back the $10,000 that I borrowed, plus the money that I made from the growth of those stocks, pay back the bank that $10,000, and I've made way more money than I would have if I just would have invested only that $1,000 that I had to begin with, right? So that's called margin investing. So lots of Americans were borrowing money to invest in the stock market. Well, the thing is, when the stock price goes up, margin investing can result in really big profits. But if the stock price goes down, not only do you lose money from investing in those stocks, you are in charge of paying back the banks the full price of the money that you invest, right? So if I borrow $10,000 from the bank, I buy $10,000 worth of stock, and the stock price drops by half, and I sell that stock, I only get $5,000 back from the sale of stock. I still have to give that $5,000 back to the bank and $5,000 of my own money, right? So margin investing is very, very dangerous as well. It's a double-edged sword. Well, lots of Americans with this long bull run in the stock market had become convinced that stocks were just going to go up and up and up. So they were borrowing more and more and more money to invest on margin. So again, if that stock price goes down, that's going to hurt more for most Americans because they had been taking out debt. So another thing that is going to cause the Great Depression is that before the economy goes down in the United States, economic times are going to be rough in global markets, especially in Europe. And so the global demand for American goods is going to go down, meaning that American manufacturers are having a harder and harder and harder time making money and expanding their business and paying off their bills. So there are going to be some global economic headwinds at the end of the 20s as well. Another thing, okay, and you're going to sense a theme here. This is a lot of causes of the Great Depression. Another thing that's going to drive the severity of the economic downturn in 1929 is the international debt structure. And this goes back to that Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I, where you remember that at the end of World War I, Britain and France placed all of the blame for World War I on Germany and forced Germany to repay the entire cost of World War I to the Allies, right? So because after World War I, that war had been so destructive to the European countries and their economies and their workforces, none of the European economies recovered very quickly after World War I. So Britain and France didn't recover very quick, and they started to depend on the reparation payments from Germany going to their economy to rebuild their economy. Well, of course, Germany was just as bad off as Britain and France were, but Germany also had the added stress of having to make those reparation payments to Britain and France. So Britain and France were just depending on money from Germany, and Germany wasn't able to come up with these reparation payments anymore. So unless something starts, giving tons of money to the European system, the economies in Europe were going to collapse. And so what the United States does, because the United States had loaned tons of money to Britain and France were expecting loans from Germany. If Germany didn't give money to Britain and France weren't going to be able to repay their loans to American banks. So American banks were invested in this situation too. Now, so what the United States decides to do is they decide to loan money to Germany to keep the German economy floating so that Germany could then make payments to Britain and France so that Britain and France could make payments back into the American banking system. And if that seems like they're just moving money in a circle right there, you would be very right? American banks to the German economy, to French economy, back to the American banks. And so rather than stimulating economic growth, this system of circular loans just goes around and around and around and around. And that's what we call the problems with the international debt structure. Okay, going on. So those were the big structural issues afflicting the American economy at the end of the 1929. If you think you can compare the American economy kind of to this set of dominoes, right? Or perhaps a Jenga tower. And each of those structural issues, the credit issue, the margin borrowing issue, the long bull run, had kind of been pulling pieces out of that Jenga tower. And the event that's going to knock over this Jenga tower is going to be the stock market sell-off starting in 1929. And some warning signs had been happening in the stock market throughout the year 1929. And so beginning kind of in the late summer and early fall of 1929, some of the more astute investors in the stock market start to think, ooh, maybe we're overbought. Maybe stock prices are too high. Maybe a downturn is right around the corner, and I should start selling my stock to preserve my profits, right? So some of the more astute investors start selling off their stock. And when other people start looking at these investors selling off their stock, they think, ooh, maybe they know something I don't. I better start selling off my stock too. So more and more people start selling stock. And then more people look at this, and then they start selling their stock as well. So the price on stocks crashes. And on Black Tuesday, this is the biggest single day crash in the stock market, where the stock market just drops like a rock. And of course, when the stock market drops like a rock, this triggers a huge run from these people who had bought stock on margin. They have to run in and start selling their stock too, so that they can recover the money to try and start paying back to the banks. Well, this becomes an even bigger issue, because not only were people borrowing from the banks to invest in the stock market, but the stock market was investing private people's savings that they were supposed to have in the bank. They were investing those in the stock market too. So when the stock price crashes, all of this money, that the people had borrowed from the bank to invest in the stock market and that the banks had invested themselves, this money just goes up in smoke. Okay, so millions of dollars in capital just vanish on the stock market. And so when people realized that their money was vanishing because it had been invested in the stock market, um, it creates something that I call the vicious cycle. When the people realize that their money was disappearing, all the people start running to the bank and asking to pull their money out of the bank. Well, of course, the banks were short on cash anyway because it had been lost in the stock market. So when the people demand to pull their money out of the banks go, sorry, we don't have enough money to give you all your money right now. We lost it on the stock market. So this triggers a panic from people called a bank run, where people go to the banks to try and pull out their money, but the banks don't have enough cash on hand to give out people's money, right? So this starts freaking people out as they realize the banks are kind of running out of money, and you start to get these bank failures, right? Well, this is where the Federal Reserve, that bank for banks, is supposed to step in and start loaning out money to keep them afloat. Well, the Federal Reserve was really scared that it would start running out of money if it started loaning money out to these banks. And it was also scared that if it started loaning out tons of money to the banks, it was going to inflate the monetary supply and stoke inflation, right? Which is a decrease in the value of money. And that's the last thing that the Reserve wanted, was to decrease the value of money. Now, this was a stupid decision on the part of the Federal Reserve, and whoever came up with this decision wasn't a very good economic thinker, because when you have banks that have lost all this capital in the stock market and they're starting to go under, the biggest problem in that situation isn't inflation. It's actually that you're going to lose the money that the economy needs to keep chugging along. So what the Federal Reserve should have done is it should have stepped in and started loaning out money to these banks that were having problems. So the fact that the Federal Reserve refused to loan out the money made this situation even worse, right? Made it even worse. Sorry. Oh, I thought my camera had stopped there, but I think we're good. Okay. So all of this stuff creates a negative feedback loop, ladies and gents, that the banks are going under, people are putting more stress on the banks, and the Federal Reserve isn't helping, which is make people even more freaking out and putting more stress on the banks. So at this point, ladies and gents, we've developed something called a negative feedback loop, where something bad happens, causes something else to happen that's bad, which causes something else to happen that's bad, which is causing something else to happen that's bad. And all these factors are working together to make a great big bad situation. And that's why, although the stock market crashed on Black Tuesday, and that was bad, without all of these other factors going on, it would have been just a stock market crash. But the fact that all of these factors are happening at the same time spells disaster for the U.S. economy, and it just knocks the U.S. economy flat off its feet, right? So that's the causes of the Great Depression. Okay, so with the crash of the economy in 1929, this was the biggest economic downturn that the United States had ever dealt with. So these wave of bank failures causes a wave of business failures, causes a wave of people losing their jobs, losing their life savings. So this had a huge impact on the day-to-day life for millions of Americans, right? So let's talk about what it was like to live in the United States during the Great Depression. So sort of the first few years of the Great Depression, the banking crisis just gets worse and worse and worse. Over 9,000 banks throughout the country close in the first few months, the first few years of the Great Depression. The average family income in the United States drops from $2,300 a year to $1,600 a year. So that's a drop of, I'm not good at math here, but almost like a quarter to a fifth of. So if you imagine, like, if you're a person making $40,000 a year in the United States, this is like all of a sudden making $30,000 or $32,000 a year, right? So that losing that amount of your income is going to make a huge hit to the standard of living that you're used to, right? So big drop in the average income. And of course, that's just the average, right? What that means is not that everybody's incomes went down by that. It means that some people kept their job. But the reason that goes down sharply is because millions and millions of Americans go from having an income to not having an income, right? So that's the reason that drops. And that's worse, perhaps. A lot of the jobs are really the job losses are concentrated in big cities as factories and manufacturers and white collar businesses start to go out of business, and this contributes to a big problem, which is urban poverty and people unable to feed themselves. So one of the most popular images that you get of the Great Depression are the people who have to depend on soup kitchens and public charity just to feed themselves, right? They can't afford to buy food. And bread lines you get in cities as well. Sometimes even people that have been making a lot of money before the Depression, they lose their job and they lose their life savings on the stock market, can't afford to buy food. So a lot of times you have these these businessmen, right, that will dress up in their business clothes, they'll pick up their briefcase, they'll go out in the morning, and of course they don't have a job to go to. So they go stand in the bread lines and wait to get bread from these bread lines to take it back home to their families to eat. Of course, millions of Americans lose their homes, too, as a result of the Great Depression. And so a lot of Americans are homeless during the Great Depression, huge homeless rates. And these Americans will start to live in things called shantytowns, which are basically just almost like campgrounds or collections of Americans who lose their home. And they have to build like these little huts out of anything that they can find, right? It's like cardboard, scrap wood, scrap tin, and these tiny little huts kind of grow together in these communities of these millions of Americans who lose their homes. Now, because Hoover is the president and people kind of blame him for the economic downturn, the slang term during the Great Depression for these shanty towns, people called them Hoovervilles, right? Like, Hoover, look at what the consequences of your actions are. People are living in these shanty towns, right? We're going to call them Hoovervilles because screw you, Hoover. As if to make things worse, in the midst of this Great Depression, the Great Plains are going to undergo a massive drought, a several-year-long drought, which is basically going to turn the soil in the Great Plains into dust, right? That the plants can't grow, and so the root system can't hold the soil down. So it's going to turn to dry dust, the soil, and windstorms are going to pick up this dust and just carry it everywhere over the West. So not only are the banks and the financial sector and the manufacturers hit, but sort of the breadbasket, the big food producing areas in the plains and in the Midwest are going to get hit by this thing called the Dust Bowl. And that's just going to decimate food production in the United States too, right? It's almost biblical, all of these bad things that happen at the same time. So you can kind of see by this lady over here, the picture, the attitude, right, of the United States is just destitute and almost shell-shocked, right? Like Americans almost can't even believe what's happening to them. And so life during Depression, not good. Okay, so I've got an extra few slides here to kind of illustrate just how bad things were during the Great Depression. So this first slide that I've got here is a graph of the money supply during the Great Depression. So here's where you can really see the impact that stock market collapse had. So if you take a look kind of beginning in the year 1900, you can kind of see the expansion of the monetary supply as the economy grows. So kind of 1904, 1905, you can see kind of World War I there, and then the big government spending during World War I that causes the growth in the economy up until 1919. You can also see the little bitty dip at the end of World War I, where we had that little recession at the end of the World War I. And then you can see what happens in the 1920s as it just goes up and up and up and up and up and up and up, right? And then all of a sudden, in 1929, Black Tuesday, with the collapse of the stock market, you can see what happens to the monetary supply where it just drops like a stone, right? That is, I mean, that's a huge depression, right? A huge reduction in the monetary supply. You know, just kind of basically sizing that up, it goes from over 40 to just under 30 billion dollars in the monetary supply, what we call M2, which is an economic term. So it drops by like a quarter the amount of money available in the economy. So if you all just take out one out of every $4 in the American economy and just poof, make it disappear, big impact, right? This next slide is GDP per capita. So it's another sort of graphical representation of how bad this downturn was. So you can see, 1929, kind of that dotted red line is if growth would have been constant in an upward trend, that's kind of what the GDP growth would have looked like. So what the size of the American economy would have looked like on average. And you can see the blue line is the actual GDP level. And you can see right at 1929, whoa, that drops, right? And it stays that way pretty much until World War II. And so that difference, right, between that red dotted line and that blue dotted line is huge. And that's tons of lost productivity and job growth that happens during the Great Depression. So next slide, you can see unemployment during the Great Depression. And you can see, again, typically the United States, we stay at about 5% unemployment, which is really typical, right? And actually seen as a good thing, because if we have about 5% unemployment, that means that about 5% of Americans are trying to find jobs or trying to find better jobs at any given point. So we actually like 5% unemployment. But you can see 1929, whoa, that huge spike up, right? That we get about 22% unemployment during the height of the Great Depression. So almost 1 in 4 Americans lose their jobs during the Great Depression. And to give you a clue, during the Great Recession that we had in 2008, when Americans were freaking out and ready to overthrow the political system, the worst unemployment rate that we had in this latest Great Recession was 10%. So more than double that is what the Great Depression was. It's a picture of the Dust Bowl, right, and how windstorms would pick up that dusty soil that was really dry in the plains in the Midwestern states, right? That's pretty gnarly. And this is the aftermath of one of those dust storms. So you can see, pretty hard to grow crops when literally your whole Model T is buried up in a dust storm, right? So it's almost biblical, all these things that are happening to the United States at this point. This is a picture of some shantytowns. The slang name is Hoovervilles. And these shantytowns would kind of pop up in random locations, in like harbors, at the outskirts of cities. And there were, thousands of these Hoovervilles throughout the country. And some of them were really quite big, with like hundreds or even thousands of residents. And all of these people were people who had lost their homes because of the Great Depression and had to build a shack or a house out of something, right, to shelter themselves. So, the fact that we couldn't deal with this issue, this Hooverville issue, really gives you a clue as to the weakness of the American economy in the 1920s. All right, class. So thanks for being patient and sticking with me through the lecture. We are on to our last slide here, 22.3, which is Hoover's response. So President Hoover was elected on the basis of his the public perception of him as kind of an economic mastermind. And so the American people would look at this crisis and kind of think, Hoover's probably the guy to get us out of this, right? He's one of the best economic minds in the United States. Now, the big problem with this is that although Hoover was a really prominent sort of economic politician, he really failed to grasp precisely how severe this economic downturn was. And Hoover had lots of faith in the ability of the free market to sort of get itself back on its feet, right? Hoover said that the United States has gone through lots of these economic downturns, and some of them are severe, but usually you give it a year or maybe 2 years, and the economy sort of gets back on its feet and starts growing again, right? Well, Hoover didn't really have an accurate conception of just how bad this depression was, right? That negative feedback cycle that I was talking about was so strong in this instance. It was so strong in 1929 that things just kept getting worse and worse and worse, right? Far worse than anything had before it. And so when Hoover starts to recognize exactly how bad things are getting, he tries to step in and get the government to start doing things to get the economy back on its feet. But Hoover is still kind of a believer in the free market. And so even though Hoover gets the government to do some things to try and help out during this economic crisis, they are either too small or they focus on trying to get the free market to start working again. And the free market was basically just flat on its feet, right? So a few things that Hoover tries to do. First is Hoover is really focused on these twin notions of voluntarism and public works. And voluntarism was basically Hoover saying that this was Hoover's way to address falling farm prices, right? So Hoover's response to falling farm prices in the wake of the Dust Bowl was to basically say, one of the problems that we have with farm prices is the fact that we have an overproduction of farm products, that because we have so much supply, way more supply than we have demand, the price of farm. So what we need to do with these falling farm prices is we need to have farmers voluntarily sell less of their product. And when farmers voluntarily sell less of their product, the prices will rebound and farmers will start to make more, right? It's sort of an oxymoron or maybe a backwards thinking. Now, of course, if you're a farmer and you're not making tons of money, are you going to voluntarily sell less of your product and reduce your income even further? No way in heck, right? So Hoover's thinking kind of makes sense in a macro or a big overarching economic sense, but when you try and convince individual farmers to voluntarily do that, never going to work, right? It's too small of a response. Another thing that Hoover is going to try and do is he's going to try and use something called public works, which is where the government basically establishes different groups to do jobs. And Hoover's hope is that through having the government provide money for jobs to do things, that hopefully people who are losing their jobs will then be able to be hired on by the government to sort of help people keep their jobs. Now, in this instance too, so many people were losing their jobs that the government couldn't hope to kind of keep up with the amount of job loss. So in this area too, Hoover's response was much too small, right? Too little, too late. Another thing Hoover tries to do is he sort of belatedly recognizes that one of the big problems affecting the U.S. economy was the drop in the monetary supply, and that this was sort of crippling the banking sector's ability to get things rolling again. So Hoover uses something called the National Credit Corporation, which is an agency, a semi-public government company, basically, that is built by the federal government, and it starts buying up the bad credit from these banks to save it, and then trying to loan this money back out again. The real issue here, though, is that this winds up preventing some loss of the monetary supply, but what really the economy needs is to have more money pumped into it, right? Way more than what Hoover is willing to do. So again, Hoover has a response that's too little, too late. Another thing that's going to damage Hoover's reputation is going to be an event called the Bonus Army March. And the Bonus Army March was a march by a group of World War I veterans who were undergoing economic stress, had lost their jobs, and they wanted to have the government pensions that were provided to them as soldiers. They wanted to have an advance on their pensions so that they could get through these tough economic times. And so they marched in a big group to Washington, D.C. and camped out on basically the White House steps, pretty much, right outside the Capitol building in the White House in Washington, D.C. And they demanded an advance on their government pensions. And Hoover, looking at these World War I veterans, basically said, no, right? I'm not going to give you an advance on these pensions. And he even got the armed forces to forcibly remove these World War I veterans from the Capitol building to sort of break up these protests. So in the midst of this huge economic depression where Hoover's not really doing what he needs to do, this is a PR nightmare for him when he refuses to provide relief to these World War veterans who had risked their lives defending our country, and he even uses the military to kick these guys off the White House, right? PR nightmare for Hoover. So by the end of Hoover's presidency, right, in the 1932, I believe, things are just getting worse, right? You have more bank failures, more people losing their jobs, more people losing their houses. The economy is just going down and down and down because this negative feedback loop is getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And we have a president who has shown that he doesn't have a grasp of the situation and that he's not willing to take the drastic measures necessary to get the United States out of this solution. So this is where we're going to end our chapter. Things aren't looking good for the United States, folks. Have a good day.